Hello, everyone, and welcome to our EDM webinar titled Data Privacy and Sovereignty, Self-Service Data Management in an AI World. I welcome our moderator, Jim Halcomb, Global Head of Research and Development of EDM Council. He will be kicking off the presentation. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Angie. Good morning, everybody. I just want to thank you for taking an hour out of your busy schedule to attend this webinar. My name is Jim Halcomb. I'm Head of Research and Development for the EDM Council. So all of our frameworks, our special interest groups, and our training programs are some of the things that I manage. I'm happy to introduce our panelists here today. We're going to be led by Piyush Mehta who's the CEO of Data Dynamics, and we're also joined by James Arnold, who's Enterprise Data and AI Governance. And while you have a mouthful, James, actually, data, AI, privacy, and security. So you've got a lot going on at CVS. So we're happy to have you both. Happy to have this conversation. It's going to be pretty conversational rather than just jumping through slides. So we're gonna really explore some topics, and we invite you to throw some questions into the Q&A because we're happy to respond as we go through this conversation over the next 45 minutes. So I want to turn it over to Piyush to introduce himself, and then James, and then we'll kick things off. Piyush.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be on, and thanks everyone for joining. As you said, James's title actually is a very good reflection of our software called Zubin, because it does address the broad length and vast nature of what he covers. So perfect conversation point. We as Data Dynamics, again, look forward to the conversation. For me, I've been a serial entrepreneur. This is my third tech company. So you could see why I have a lot of loss of hair as a result of these startups as they go on. But I think what's near and dear to everybody is the conversation around data. And especially in this world where data continues to be an asset to be mined, and mined in a way that can deliver value, that can apply to businesses to be far more prudent in how they leverage it. We look forward to how we can help and contribute to that journey, and have done so over the last 12 years with some of the largest companies out there, 28 of the Fortune 100, 6 of the top 10 banks. So really understand enterprise challenges as it comes to data, and look forward to the conversation with both of you.
Yeah, same. James.
James Arnold. I started my career in the military and the government back in the day when mainframes ruled everything, and then slowly transformed to this new cloud world. Of course, the standard disclaimer, anything I say today is my own opinion and not necessarily reflective of CVS because I work for a corporation. And I would just say, I love the fact that you have dedicated software. I believe my current job title and a lot of the other things, the third parties, the vendors are really stepping forward and realizing there is a need to control data security. There's a need to control information access, not generally by the application, but also the row, column, field level. That's not something we necessarily could do several years ago, or at least we couldn't do it very easily. There's a lot of new techniques. There's a lot of new applications. It's a very exciting time to be.
Absolutely. And just want to throw out a question to the group just to get the conversation going. If you don't mind letting us know, what's your biggest challenge in using unstructured data for AI modeling? So as all of you know who are here for this conversation, unstructured data is increasingly because of AI, right? You know, AI is scooping all this stuff up and spitting it out the other end with some challenges that pertain to privacy and access and so forth. And so it's starting to bring that I think in my experience, data management has been very ambiguous or ambivalent about bringing unstructured data into the scope of its responsibilities because of a lot of those technical challenges, James, that you were pointing out. But now everything's AI is changing our industry, changing the scope. And And yeah, okay, so we've got a clear majority.
Yeah. I completely agree as well. A lot of the privacy and compliance, I will say initially, at least from my personal experience, it's a lot of times that unstructured and semi-structured data, you have to get it in a form wherever it is. It could be a recording, it could be a form, it could be something, it could be a web form. And you need to get that into a structured data, more of a structured data kind of format with the appropriate metadata. How are you identifying it? How are you classifying it? What is the use and purpose specification? So I have a form that's coming in. It's generally used for insurance applications. I need to make sure that the consent that was given by the data consumer themselves, the data customer, or the data subject, depending on where you are in the world. Did they give consent to use this in a certain way? Is it for a loan application? If it's for a loan application, you can't really use it past that unless there's appropriate notice, disclosures, additional
Right.
consent, et cetera. So finding that happy balance between I have this wonderful information and how can I use it appropriately and ethically, I say is the hardest part right now. And it all comes down to the appropriate metadata and how to really accurately get it.
Well, this poll is reflecting that. It's what's interesting to me is that nobody is having a problem, or at least not their biggest problem. I guess we have to be looking at it from that perspective around observability. That's interesting to me. But did you have any comments before we proceed, Piyush?
Yeah, I mean, the big challenge is, when you think about AI, it's a land grab. A
Mhm.
model doesn't know what it doesn't know in terms of what it is accessing. So this whole concept of unstructured data becomes even more prevalent right now because those silos of those pockets of where unstructured data resides is pretty spread out across an organization. And from a model standpoint, as long as I have network and I have privilege and I have access, I'm touching whatever I have access to. Because the more I can ingest, the more accurate and the more um, value I can bring. And I think that's the big challenge. And to James's point, right? Privacy and compliance become a big issue in that because making sure you have the right consents and making sure you have the right knowledge of what data are you accessing to address those models.
So let's kind of get into the meat of it. And I'll just say before you get into it that I've been over the as you guys know, I was speaking at conferences over the past couple of weeks and hearing a lot of the current chatter, the current topics and conversations in the industry, and this is a hot topic. Unstructured data is becoming more and more of an industry concern, and I think this is a very relevant and an important topic for us to be having here, especially with all the things that you're covering now. So if you don't mind, Piyush, just kind of walk us through some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this year we went and sat with people in Saudi, people in UAE, people in India, um, different countries in Europe, and you're finding a recurring theme, which is this concept of national sovereignty. And that national sovereignty is much easier when you have physical boundaries. But in a digital world, how do you implement national sovereignty? And it's easier said than done, especially when you're a multinational organization or company. And yes, GDPR has been around for a while, but GDPR's actual implementation and the hand slapping has been minimal if you think about it. But now you're seeing over 50 countries that are deploying national sovereignty laws, which means that it becomes extremely arduous to make sure that you are protecting citizens' information. And what we found, especially, we did a roundtable in India with the US consulate in Mumbai. And we had some of the largest organizations, Indian organizations, and their biggest concern was, hey, it's a trust factor. If we can't commit to making sure that we provide transparency to our customers and how we're managing their data, and God forbid we have a breach, they will quickly switch. So this concept of trust actually has a direct impact on whether people will do business with you. And that's something that if whether you read the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Bloomberg, Financial Times, every day one of the headlines is somebody lost data or somebody exposed to data. It just amazes me, right? Every single day there's something or the other that showcases that. I think today's headline was money grab. that lost, consumer information. And that has a direct impact. So the question is, how do you drive that? Not just because it's required from a regulatory framework. How do you drive that? Because it has a direct business impact. You're going to lose customers. And that's catching real C-level attention that goes beyond technology, right? You're getting CEOs truly involved in the business that say, hey, how are we managing the data? And tell me more. And I'm sure James is dealing with this, at CVS, where it's not just an IT problem anymore. It's a compliance, but more importantly, it's a business problem. So it's interesting how broad this now spreads in terms of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah, James, what are you seeing from your end of things, especially since you have the weight of all of these things on your head?
A lot of it comes, yeah, exactly. A lot of it comes to the side. I would actually reference OAuth's guidance. They came out with recommendations for data enclaves and federated learning, rather than putting basically all your eggs in one basket. Spread it out, make them secure, have them secure processing areas. So that way, if someone has to process sensitive personal information, and do it in a place that's appropriate to process that sensitive information, potentially even where data minimization is not possible, at least have a way of aggregation, within your processes, within what the business is actually doing. Keep it in a black box. If the output could be aggregated data, the output is an aggregated data. Can these AI models, only the AI models, so non-humans, have access to all this sensitive data, but no humans are actually looking at it? It's actually a lot safer. Of course, you have to account for bias and everything else, but it's definitely we're entering an area where we can trust machines more than we can trust people, because the machine will only do what you tell it to do or stay within its parameters.
Yeah, that is an interesting topic about the interaction between people and AI, and it's not as straightforward as I would have thought. One of the things that I've begun to notice is that, well, basically there's an age-old tension, right, between innovation and regulation. And it's interesting to see different organizations respond to that challenge in vastly different ways. On the health side, not surprisingly, there's a lot of restraint, to the point where there are organizations that are not approving the use of LLMs at all. Or if they do, it has to go through a central sort of review board that evaluates the use case and gives kind of a little bit of leash, but under strict observation. And then on the flip side, outside of that, in more the retail space, it's in some cases it's just rampant. Just let her rip, let everybody use it however they want. Because and really it seems to me that the difference between them is the amount of regulation and the amount of what people perceive as harm. I'm phrasing my words carefully because I don't
Potential
think
harm absolutely is one of those scary, scary things. Data ethics and potential harm, where if you're not dealing with HIPAA, if you're not dealing with GDPR, if you're not dealing with LIBA, you're in that retail space. That's a happy place to be.
Yeah, and its relationship with healthcare is, I think, becoming more and more of a challenge, right? Because you have organizations that have health data but are not subject to HIPAA. And then you have organizations subject to HIPAA that are now having difficulty being able to compete on a data perspective with organizations that don't, right? And I don't know if that's been coming up in what you've been seeing, Piyush, but and if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. When you think about regulatory frameworks, right, typically verticals like financial services, healthcare, and energy are probably the most impacted in terms of construct. And that challenge continues, because they have specific needs to make sure that they're guarding and protecting that data in an appropriate manner as, good custodians. But what you're also seeing beyond that when you look at national laws that are being put into place to protect consumer interest, that spans across verticals, which is really interesting because now you have industries that have never worried about regulation from a data protection standpoint, now having to implement guardrails. And how do you implement that guardrail? And I also believe customers are getting savvy. It's as generational shift is happening, you're seeing those 20, 30, 40-year-olds asking, what are you doing with this data? Whereas if you ask my parents, they probably wouldn't know enough to ask that question. And
Right.
they just press a click. And I think that generational shift is having a direct impact on this as well, because now it becomes smarter consumers. And if you have smarter consumers, they're prone to ask more questions, and that's going to lead to making sure that you have the ability to answer those. So it's a convergence of the macro taking place as well as, um, jurisdictional laws that are coming in. And I think AI is a driver that's going to accelerate even more of a need to make sure that there's transparency in how data is handled.
Mhm.
Transparency and probably an increase in control. One of the things that these statistics that you're bringing up is reminding me of is data retention, and my experience of how few organizations actually purge data. Data retention is just they keep it all, and now I'm sure AI is starting to show the weaknesses of just hanging on to anything and everything and having it on your servers available for the AI to scoop up, right?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of customers now question over retention. Before, over retention was never a question, even though everybody said lifecycle management. The end of lifecycle management was long-term archive. It wasn't deletion.
Right.
And now the question becomes, if I have it, it's either going to be accessed and used. It's a surface area for attack from a security standpoint.
Mhm.
There's a cost factor to also keeping it. And then there's privacy exposure. So when I take all of this into account, and then there's a legal ramification. If I have it, I have to produce it.
Yeah.
So, if something has a
Right.
7 retention law and I keep it for 15 years, by default, I have to expose it if that's being asked for as part of any inquiry. And I think that's leading to a lot of firms to question it. And now you're seeing a convergence also with a lot of our customers of compliance, legal, and line of business getting together and saying, what is that right retention timeline? Because before it was one of them would say something and punt it to the next, and the other would say it back, and you'd never get an answer, right? And that's why you had this perpetual retention. And
Yes.
now they don't have a choice because they're seeing that becomes a potential area of attack. So from a security standpoint and from a privacy standpoint, it's trying to get to the right convergence of saying, what is that right timeline? And for each line of business, each application owner, it's going to be different. But the fact that they are communicating with legal, with compliance to put that together, we are finally seeing a lot of our customers saying, hey, can you make sure you're putting this retention tag on the bucket or on the file versus before it was more about lifecycle management, but it was left to an ambiguous answer.
Yes, a very ambiguous answer in many cases that I found.
100%.
I found that master data management and getting involved in the retention world is probably, or especially that the MRD side. What are my retention codes? Where do they apply? And
Right.
from at a schema level, can I apply a retention code to this? Can I apply it at the row or column level? Once it gets into the data catalog, for me, it's truly managed. Until that happens, it's a
Right.
guess. Same thing with applications. And until you actually get to the root of that data and you say, okay, this is what I'm doing specifically, everything was a best guess. So I've seen data at organizations I've worked at, we're literally 300 years old. So there's a fun
Wow.
fact at a Japanese bank where they had, Edo period records. Like that's when you've gone too far. Love them to death, but it's like, okay, we got a translator and keep them. Do we
Right.
take them to a museum? Like, but you have those conversations like, okay, I thought 7 to 10 years was a lot. That's a bit much. But Different countries do different things. It's very interesting. Depending on jurisdictional impacts, this conversation can massively differ.
So let's talk about the large language models, because that's specifically when we're talking about AI and the impact that AI is having on our field in the area of unstructured data. It's really the LLMs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
go ahead.
no, I think you hit it earlier, right? Which is enterprises are getting more cautious on the use of LLMs being deployed into the environment. And it's around also a need to do model management, right? Because there's so many models being thrown out there almost literally on a daily basis. And anybody can caveat a model and make it customized, and now you have to deal with managing it in the enterprise. The challenge with LLM is the fear that what goes back into mothership, meaning, is it really training and doing generative AI and the RAG piece locally, or is there something being sent back from what it's taught? And that leads to that caution. And the problem is, because this data is so spread out, it's not easy to tell what you're accessing, at least in most cases. So that's where the need for ethical importance comes in, right? Making sure that it's not accessing data that has either consumer information of that company or private information of patient data in medical records, social security numbers, passport numbers that could have any potential of exposure. And we're seeing that actually lead to one of the first questions you get asked is, do you have LLM in your software? And if you do, there's a different path of control that they have to go through to validate its use within the environment, versus a traditional, let's say, NLP or regex or data modeling technology, where it's much more controlled and known, and they're not as concerned about the external exposure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, James, what exposure have you had to LLMs, presenting some of these challenges in your past?
In my view, it's all about reliability, resilient, responsible. Under responsible, you're going to have fair and ethics. Where it comes into, I guess the biggest problem is really model poisoning, knowing what data really goes in there. I love that you mentioned, is there passport numbers? The unstructured data, unless it's appropriately classified, who knows? Because a lot of times you're just throwing it at a model because you have no idea what's in there. Hey, I wonder what's going to happen. The data owners themselves really have to take ownership of these things and warn people, warn the data scientists, hey, by the way, this is the kind of data we're collecting. And unfortunately, data ownership isn't always the best or easiest thing. It's transferred from people to people as people cycle out of companies and move around. But then having that accurate classification, even at a high level, is there SPI or sensitive personal information, where you're going to have your government issue identifiers, you're going to have those passport numbers, you're going to have social security numbers, those kind of things. To me, that's basically the two sides. Does this have SPI or does this not? If it doesn't have SPI, I'm in a much better, feeling in my chest, because it's not going to be as risky.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples of that is, we think of personal information typically as passport, social security, whatnot. One of the simplest things is people store passwords within the files and the records they keep, and they write it as PSWP or password. I mean, literally.
Yeah.
Did an audit for a bank, and we found of records that have passwords in them. Now think about that, right? It's human nature. I gotta save it somewhere, because what if I forget? Where do I save it? I save it in a file. Well, that file technically could be accessed, and if nobody's classified it correctly, as James said, and nobody's actually bothered to look if it has things like passwords, you would never think that, hey, I have to worry about it. An Excel file could have a list of domains or information with passwords in them, and all of a sudden, there you go in terms of exposure. So it's the smallest of things that can create exposure that I find that is really interesting. We think about the big things. One file, one Excel file, one Word file, it's one document, that has all the HR records. All of a sudden you have exposure. So, and you're talking about organizations with billions of files or objects. So you're exponentially growing that unstructured bucket. You're talking about things like Snowflake and Databricks and other Splunk and other repositories that continue to become dumping ground. That's SharePoint, classic example. How many customers really know what's there? It's user generated. People store stuff, and years go by, and all of a sudden you have a lot of data in there. So I think it's an interesting time because AI now brings that to light that, hey, does AI have access to that, or does the model have access? And if it does, how am I prudent in managing its classification, tagging, and controls around access?
Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the statistics you have here. 80% of
Yep.
enterprise data is unstructured, and the amount of data is going from 120 to 181. Tell me what a zettabyte is. I actually don't.
Petabyte, exabyte, zettabyte, maybe?
That's a lot.
Higher? Is there a
Yeah.
fourth?
We probably nobody cares what exactly it is, but it's a lot and it's growing fast. So I'm assuming I just apply 80% to those numbers, and that's the growth rate of unstructured data, and therefore with AI and the potential for LLMs to scoop that stuff up and spit it out the other side with virtually no controls over it, is increasing the risk exponentially for organizations if they're not getting a handle on it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that 80% is increasing upwards as more data grows, because more data is growing in the unstructured than the traditional structured world. So actually that number keeps inching up year over year.
6 petabytes.
Well, I mean, these LLMs are generating unstructured.
Right.
So we're kind of, amping that up, as it were. I'd actually like to see, I'd like to see them have LLMs that generate structured data personally. So let's move on to hear back from our audience here. What level in the organization is your governance empowered? We're assuming you have governance. It's just we didn't put an answer if you don't, but we'll find out, I guess. And
this is an interesting question, right? Because if you think about it, the governance that most companies put in is at an enterprise level. So it'll be interesting to see how many of the folks have anything beyond a central enterprise way of managing.
Yeah, and I've been in organizations that definitely have just a department or a line of business that happens to have their governance act together, but they're still struggling to get it at an enterprise level. So I do see that. What I at the data owner level, that's where things are, where everybody's wanting to move. It seems it's like a good idea to be to have a data mesh culture, but without the technology to support it, it's probably going to take a while for organizations to adopt that.
I personally love the hub and spoke, but that's where you have the fiefdoms doing their own thing. Sometimes like the CFO shop will be perfect, and then everyone else is a decade behind. I'd say that's the most common thing I've seen.
The CFO,
Yeah, financial reporting would be on point, and everyone else is just do their best.
Been there, done that. In financial institutions, I've noticed more in the where they're making financial decisions using data.
Liquidity risk, especially.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
They have a single.
We've got not an unsurprising preponderance of enterprise governance, as opposed to it just being stuck in IT, and none of them at the department or line of business level. So that's encouraging.
Yeah, the challenge is that even though you have enterprise governance, having that permeate through down to the data owner is an important aspect. So the hub concept that James spoke about is critical, because what happens is you can define policies centrally, but if you don't empower locally, there's a miss in between those layers. And whether you look at it from a CIO, CISO, or CDO standpoint around governance, the challenge we see is there's a lot of policies out there. But at the end, it's the data owner or the application owner, right, who actually is the true controller of his or her data. And it's getting them to understand those policies, but then execute on them within the confines of their data, because they're the jurisdiction that counts as it relates to the data they own. And I think that's a big delta that exists today in the market, where you see a lot of good products that drive centralized management, but then it doesn't permeate where they empower the data owners to actually execute on.
Yeah. I'd say Europe is probably where you're going to have more of that, just because they have more of a clearly defined structure. BCBS 239 for regulatory reporting, there's data controllers, there's data owners, there's data processors. Everyone knows, like, in a RACI, this is me. This is what I'm doing. This is my part to play. In the States, it's a little less like defined. And a lot of times we'll have data owners or something similar to a data owner, but we don't really have any of those intermediary steps. And those intermediary steps really help drive the program.
Yeah, so let's move on to the ownership conversation here. Yeah, because it used to be that that there was a lot of debate about ownership versus stewardship. I'm glad to see that for the most part the industry has kind of huddled around the idea that ownership is really the most important. I mean, stewardship is really important, but if you don't have owners, then you don't have any accountability at the source, right? For the data. So if you don't mind kind of walking us through some of your thoughts here around ownership, Piyush.
I think the ownership drives one fundamental factor, which is culture. So if you don't have the right ownership level empowerment, you're not culturally driving the responsibility of being a trusted custodian. And that's the delta you get with having owners being key and integral. When you look at what drives that digital transformation, at the end, it is the data owners who are key to driving and executing on it. And we're seeing that across the board. So you see C-level execs, including CIOs, including board members, understand and ask about risk, because that's a key factor in business decision making. But it permeates all the way down. So although this is a great pictorial of that, but it's truly driving that data democratization culture where every person within an organization realizes and accepts the responsibility they have across the data that they are responsible for or have created, whether you look at it from an application or a direct end user standpoint. And I think that's critical. And if you can drive that and make that cultural, then it becomes part of your ethos. And then new people come in or out, you have a structure of how you expect governance to be thought about in terms of handling of the data. And I think that's really important. And you're seeing that change take place, because with AI comes that responsibility. And by the way, if you think about AI, who drives the use of those models? An application or a data owner to derive value. So who better to know and understand their data than the people who want to actually leverage it?
Absolutely. And I like some of these statistics here about strengthening your data privacy and compliance, that 74% of companies are seeing an improved regulatory and privacy outcomes by pushing it down to that level. I've done that in the past where, on the one hand, you can have a super awesome catalog, as you were talking about, James, and you can rip through the environment, discover and spin up the metadata that you have. You can tag it with your classification scheme, and all that's wonderful. But it's prone to being wrong, or at least not as good as if the actual owner of the data is evaluating the privacy and security concerns. And it's better to have your people informed about what those policies are, right? And I mean, you want to have these tools, they're absolutely necessary, but the cultural component is really how you get scalability, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I'd also say it also goes to the maturity. Um, Not everyone a lot of times, you're starting off using raw data. Once you get in conform tables, data quality had to step in. They did some things. You're doing enrichment, you're doing other conformance rules. Once you get to that conform table as model input, you're going to get a lot more ROI. It's without a data owner, you're never getting that conform table. Not really. You're not getting someone as a data producer taking that responsibility as a data producer, a data owner sharing his data. To really say, okay, I'm making sure there's no material changes to schema. I'm taking accountability for schema drift. I'm making sure there's the right kind of protections in these data sets. And then I'm encouraging other people and educating them. This is what the initial use of this data was. And then you're clearly stating that to your data consumers. When you have a data owner, all of that is possible. Until you have a data owner, that becomes almost impossible to do. Even if you have a robust data catalog, you need someone to really help out, coordinate with the business stewards, coordinate with the data consumers, and then everything just like happens a little easier.
And if you look at that last stat, it's very important, right? Like
Mhm.
McKinsey points to, you know, the ability of data owners enhances collaboration, leading to 20 to 30% improvement in business outcomes. That's an
Wow.
impact of P&L, right? At the
Yeah.
end of the day, if you're a healthcare company in the life sciences space and you're doing clinical trials, your ability to share that clinical trial information, knowing that you've extracted the privacy information and make sure it's secure, with vertically within the organization, but also externally, drives better collaboration, which is going to lead to better outcome, which means better research quicker. That leads to a potential go-to-market solution. You see that across all sectors where you're seeing this siloed approach to an enterprise only having their own data versus saying, hey, how do I extract the PII or the business sensitive information? But then there's that 80%, 90% in there that still has tremendous value. And now, the more I can broaden that canvas and use AI modeling to go extract value across multiple of those that may be cross organizations, you're
Mhm.
going to see huge impact in terms of time to market.
Yeah, I'm just looking, 20 to 30% is pretty significant. And I'm wondering what kind of business outcomes they're referring to, but definitely that reduction in silos and driving better governance. When, data warehousing puts a big or a lake or whatever your solution is that you're trying to increase the accessibility of data, also puts a giant buffer between uh, the owners and the consumers, and it can often kind of slow down the process if you're not identifying those owners all the way at the source, right?
The hardest thing for a data scientist is to know what data set should I use. When you have a
Yeah.
data owner can contextualize it. You have someone ask that question. Hey, I'm doing this. Would your data make sense?
Right.
That's invaluable.
Yeah, because
Absolutely.
they own the context, right? They
Yeah.
own the process. They know what it means beyond what can just be captured in a business glossary or a data dictionary. We have a question. If you want to take a look at that, we have from Snezana. I'm gonna butcher her or his last name, so I apologize. But there's an agreement around the how unstructured data accounts for the largest amount of data, and that it's over retained. I think we all violently agree with that statement. Should there be a solution for unstructured data cleanup? Do you have any view on that?
We are great question, and it's something that we are seeing a lot of attention being put to. We're working with one of the largest European banks in actually addressing this specific issue, where they do have over retention, over 200 plus petabytes of data sitting there and almost perpetually stored. So the question becomes, how do you analyze it? How do you determine, first of all, what has PII and business sensitive information? Secondly, if it doesn't, is there a need to keep it? Third, if it does, how do you classify and tag it with some kind of retention timeline? And that's where, when I say it's a collaborative effort, it's breaking the silos of CDOs, CIOs, CISOs, legal, and merging it into a standardized way of working together in a collaborative manner. And we're seeing that more and more, where you're not saying, if you typically look at it, each one used to have their own quote unquote tools to analyze and define, but they wouldn't cross communicate and talk. And now we're seeing the need for those silos to be broken and have an aggregate solution that may give views from the lens of each of those constituents that I mentioned, but allow them to aggregate that into a single methodology, a single software that drives that into execution. So absolutely, it's something we're seeing. And it's not just regulatory driven, it's a question of just exposure and risk to keeping the data that's driving that.
Yeah, and there was also part of the question about shouldn't there be a standard that guides all organizations across all industries in the identification and treatment of sensitive data?
The challenge with that, Jim, is jurisdictions have an impact on how you define it.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect. Secondly, verticals, in terms of which companies are in what vertical, have its own nuance to it. Third, each application may have their own nuance and twist. So as you keep peeling the onion, you have more and more of quote unquote customization where, a single rule doesn't apply to all. You could have two corporations that are financial services or healthcare companies, but because of jurisdiction, because of the type of applications they're running, have very defined different rules of engagement as it comes to data and how they define their data catalog. So in Nirvana, yeah, I mean, it would be great to have one standard definition and dictionary.
If it were just a philosophical exercise,
right.
For example, like I'm sure that others have gone down the path of defining a customer.
Correct.
And then you realize that you can't force a common sense unified definition of a customer. You have to define it in its appropriate context because of some of these factors which are completely beyond your control, especially the jurisdictional part. Good luck with that, right? It almost seems like jurisdictions can try to be disharmonious with each other. For those of us who've had to try to, harmonize and manage that from a reference data perspective, I being one of them, it can be a serious challenge and a serious headache, but one that you just have to live with, right?
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about like things in the US, right, it's state level data management from a jurisdiction.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
National. California is different than New York, is different than
There's
Texas.
20 different state privacy laws right now and hundreds of other stuff related. It's a nightmare, and until we actually get to a point of a national privacy law, it's just going to get worse.
Correct.
Yeah, well, that even extends because part of my background is in the health payer, and and all of the codes for the procedures for similar procedures might have different codes,
right?
And have different levels of standard of care depending upon the state, which to a physician is ridiculous, but that's the way the state's defined it, and so there you go. So
I am praying that the ICD-10 codes and we move maybe to ICD-11 where we adjust that. I was involved in a lot of the I-9 to I-10 changeover several years ago, and I have to tell you, everyone was very hopeful there'd be more of a direct relationship, and just everyone uses the same thing, but that's not what happened. Claims remains to be, reconciliations especially, is still way more complicated than it needs to be.
Yes. We've got just a little bit of a time check here. We've got about 13 minutes, 12 minutes to finish up all the things that we want to finish up on. But let's go ahead and proceed here, and we'll be monitoring for questions if anybody has any further questions. So Priyush, if you want to kind of kick us off here with this self-service.
This is really interesting, right? We we learn from our customers and realize that the only way to effectively drive governance and drive compliance is to allow the data owners to be empowered to execute on central policy decision making. So, we released a software called Zubin, which allows us to do this self-service data management. And I think that's going to be key for almost every enterprise going forward, because as I mentioned, centralized governance without the empowerment of the data owner is just not effective. And what we're finding is it leads to stagnation. And that stagnation means you have a lot of good ideas, a lot of good policies in place, but they don't get executed upon in terms of the actual data management.
Right.
So the ability to say, hey, I am going to set central policy. For example, I could say, hey, if something is over X years old, not touched, and doesn't have PII, central IT could say lifecycle management means I move it to a hyperscaler. Which hyperscaler and where it moves is a central IT function as a policy. But the execution of that is done by the data owner. And that's important because if you think about it, otherwise you hang in there yourselves, right? Because let's say I'm moving, AWS is my preferred choice and I decide to move it to Azure. So that's where central technology controls are important. Same thing with definitions of what is PII, what is business sensitive. Those things are corporate governed, and what is the retention period, right? You don't want to leave that ambiguous. You want that to be central. And that's where legal can come in. That's where compliance can come in. But then the execution of saying, hey, out of the 10,000 records I own, or the files or the data created from my application that I own, what percentage of that or which ones of that actually apply? And then how do I classify and tag it? And I think the classification of the data is a very integral part of the lifecycle journey, because the decision making of what you do with the data is dependent on the classification.
Yep.
And how accurately can you do it? And one of the challenges there that we see is, most of the companies we deal with have billions of records, right, and files and data points. You can't possibly open each and every one. So how do you do it intelligently? That's another place where AI becomes a key catalyst. How do you use sampling as a means to derive accuracy and do so intelligently? And then how do you make sure that you assess risk, which is the absolute number one thing right now that we're being asked about? Is risk associated to privacy, risk associated to security from an access management, and risk associated to pure data sprawl. And those are all things that right now every organization is trying to address and limit exposure. I don't think there's a nirvana that says it's 100% bulletproof. But how do I mitigate my attack surface? And I think that's where, again, driving the cultural behavior, using the self-service capability. And if you can take each of these circles and technically align them to a single software based on your roles, then you actually drive consistency across the environment. Otherwise, that's the other problem we see. There's 20, 30, 40 different softwares being used by different people based on their roles to try and put this together, and they don't talk to each other. So there's always this conflict of A doesn't know what B is saying, B doesn't know C, so on. And that creates its own mess, right? And then that leads to, again, the word stagnation. Well, I don't know, go talk to legal. Legal says, well, I don't know, go talk to compliance. And it just becomes a never-ending reason for over-retention.
Yeah, I don't know who among us here is familiar with the CDMC. It's one of the frameworks that we have, and it stands for Cloud Data Management Capabilities. And one of the important factors of the CDMC, there's not a lot that's new in it, because there are lots of places you can turn to for control, the need for controls for privacy and security, but where it kind of comes in and makes it where it's unique is bringing in the whole data management slice, right? And how important that is, because it pretty much advocates that you can't do all these things very effectively if you're not harnessing, and this is a key word here, catalog of catalogs. To your point, there's a lot of automation, there's a lot of tools that are embedded throughout the organization. And it can be, and with the benefits of having a single solution, no question, you get more standardization across the board, but it can be a challenge to rip out some of these things. And sometimes the best you can do is harmonize. And so the CDMC kind of takes the approach that you can have a catalog that has hooks into the other catalogs on key metadata to make all that stuff work. You're familiar?
To me, that's the data lake concept. This is something in my past 5 orgs. Every single org had the same thing. We don't have one data catalog. We have 40. It's like,
exactly.
We don't have one information asset register. It's tied into 16 other data catalogs. But at the end of the day, where can I just aggregate all that and report it at one place? I would say that is the dream in the metadata management perspective, to truly capture that data risk, which we're all trying to get to. If you can do that, I think that's the dream of everyone. When there's an LLM that helps us to do that, perfect. But in the meantime, we're all having lots of fun with this.
So unless there were other comments that you wanted to throw in there, I thought I'd open it up for a few more questions if we have any from our audience. Let's see. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I wanted to ask you to, Piyush, to introduce us to the solution that you guys have and what your business is about.
Yeah, so we are a software company focused on driving data democratization. And that really means how do we make enterprise customers, both public and private sector, better custodians of data. To address that, we have a software called Zubin. And the theme there is bytes to rights. And it's around this whole concept of data democratization. The beauty to the software is to address some of the things that we spoke about and really reflects the challenge that the title that James has. How do you address security? How do you address data compliance? How do you address data governance and lifecycle management under a single umbrella and get out of the world of point solutions? And then more importantly, how do you also take that context and say that each person who accesses the software based on their roles gets their own view and ability to execute? So you have centralized policy management done by CISO, CIO, CDO, but then executed by the data owners. And again, it's driving that common theme because we see it too often over the years that we said this is a missing gap and a missing bridge, whether it is to classify data, whether it is to re-permission data, whether it is to tag properly for PII or sensitivity, whether it's lifecycle management, whether it's deletion, regardless of the use case, how do you drive that at the data owner level? And all of those are covered under the Zubin platform. And then that becomes a huge valuable asset because now you're managing centrally the policies. You can see which lines of business are doing effective data management, and then down to the data owner who gets to actually execute on it. And it reduces a lot of the disconnects that happen between different organizational team members.
We had a couple of questions come in. They're starting to pile in. So we got a question about data quality. We have a question about retention triggers, and a follow-up question on triggers. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so from retention standpoint, again, defined differently either due to regulatory reasons or due to internal corporate policy. Typically, it can either be from last access time, it could be from creation time. It just depends on the organization and what they are trying to conform to. And that's where the convergence of metadata tied to the type of data in terms of content comes into the context versus content capability. But typically it's one of those two parameters, and that determine, data retention timelines, internal regulation or external regulation, or a combination of both.
Something that I've done around retention is driving it from the business continuity perspective. If you've been going through your tabletops and your war room exercises to identify, one of the things that you look to identify are what are the core processes and aspects of your technology stack that are absolutely necessary to maintain the continuity of the business, if you're going to have to choose, right? Well, if you've done that and you've made that decision, those processes and platforms then drive the data that's of highest importance to protect.
The
And I've
challenge
noticed
with
just one more thing. I'm sorry, I just want to say one more thing is the reason why I'm pointing at that is because I've tried going at it from the reverse perspective of nobody's touched this in 10 years.
yeah,
Let's purge it. And that hasn't been for me a foolproof approach. Somebody sees it and they're like, whoa, wait a minute. I know I haven't touched that in 10 years, but we need that. Okay. All right. So
and that's where, Jim, the ability of the data owner to take that action comes into place, because the
yes.
answer to what you said is, I need that, can only
Yep.
be determined by the data owner, not by any other central policy. Remember,
Yep.
what we're finding, over 70% of the data is not touched in over 3 years in every organization. Now, that doesn't mean you don't need to retain it, right? Back to your point.
Mhm.
The question really becomes, the only person who really understands the nuances of each and every data is the data owner. So that's where they need to come in and give that final say. And it can't just be a pure carte blanche on the retention timeline.
Right. Yeah, which is what I like about this
Yep.
dashboard at the owner level. So it's pushing these decisions all the way down to the
Yep.
identified owner.
And I think we had one more question, right? The
We
data.
did. How does data quality of a big organization impact AI models?
I mean, again, I think the more data you have, the more it's going to ingest it. I would just keep it as simple as that. Whether or not valid, not valid, how it skews the data set, there's a lot of questions to be asked and answered there. Opens its own can of worms, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's funny how we can forget this because AI can be so impressive now. Is garbage in, garbage out, right?
AI fails faster. So if you don't have
Yes.
data quality, it's model poisoning. That's how I say it. Congratulations. It's just model poisoning at this point.
All right. Well, we need to. We're at the top of the hour here. Is there anything quickly you wanted to say about this, or we?
I think we've covered it again. Definitely check us out at datdine.com, and we'd be happy to see how we can help, as we do with other enterprises, kind of break down these silos into a single centralized software model that allows the data owner to be empowered to execute.
Yeah, and I just say for those of you who are new to the EDM Council, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that I have groups, special interest groups. We do have a special interest group called Data Risk. In that group, this is a very relevant topic, and we're getting ready to kind of start up some projects, some industry working groups. So please check us out if you're interested in being a part of that community. I want to thank you, Piyush, for sharing with us what you've learned around this topic. And James, thank you so much for providing more of the practitioners' perspective on this. We appreciate the questions and everybody showing up. So have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us today for this talk.
Thanks for having us. Take care.
Thanks all.